So, and as Jerome says, a very warm welcome to everybody, and particularly on a very damp day where I am. But I hope the next hour or so will be really stimulating and give you plenty of food for thought. Our happy hour sessions, for those of you who don't know, were developed very much under lockdown as our regional events and networking meetings were put on hold due to the pandemic. And they very quickly have become very popular ways of the LIN maintaining our networking activities online. And in fact, going digital has been transformational for many of us in both in our sort of professional and working careers, in our domestic situations, but also in the way we're able to maintain communications and draw attention to the latest policies and practice. As Jerome says, this is also Mental Health Awareness Week, and we're really delighted to both for the LIN to be supported by Mental Health Foundation, who are the genesis of the Mental Health Awareness Week, and for their support of our mental health pages. And we're also we'll be joined by Jolie Goodman, who's the Programme Manager for Empowerment and Later Life, both talking about the week, but also particular work that they've been instrumental on, working closely with adults, older adults. And we're also going to be joined by the Director for Mental Health at Look Ahead to delve into a really interesting piece of work that came out. Well, Angelina can tell us a bit more about that a month or so ago around the sort of the financial case for mental health services. And then finally, we're joined by the Director at ECIST, Ben Channon. And some of you will know Ben through writing a really influential book around a guide to architecture and mental well-being. So what we've tried to do today is really craft a session which is of different aspects of how to support and enable, encourage people, both in terms of the loneliness and isolation people might experience, right through to the built environment, as well as the relationships with health and social care, very much at the heart of what the LIN does. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Jolie. What you may not know is that about half an hour ago, we were panicking because Jolie had been invited to give an interview on Radio 5, but that got pulled at the last minute. So she's got an even bigger audience with the LIN. So welcome, Jolie.
Thanks. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen now, and then I'll take you through the presentation. From the beginning, come on. Okay, so I'm actually going to be talking about two things today, but I haven't had an opportunity really to look back at my work for the foundation, as you know, now I'm programs manager, so I'm really welcome that opportunity. The title of what I'm going to speak about is called Standing Together, which refers to a number of projects that we've run with the later life housing schemes, standing together to improve the emotional health and community connections of older people. As Jeremy has mentioned, it's Mental Health Awareness Week, and the theme is nature. So the second half of my talk, I'll be talking a little bit about using nature as we emerge from the pandemic, and thinking about how for people in later life particularly, perhaps nature can be a really good way to support how they transition into a new phase of life. Some people have found the pandemic very, very difficult, but I think a lot of us are quite used to how we're living in a very different way, and we're really going to vary. And I think for all of us, how we emerge is going to be a really big thing. So I thought I'd say a little bit about the Mental Health Foundation. We think a lot about good mental health for all. We also adopt kind of a public mental health approach, and we're looking for kind of quite broad, sometimes universal solutions for everybody that support their mental health and well-being. So our mission is to help people understand, protect, and sustain their mental health. And I guess it feels very important that prevention is our priority, and that's across the life course. So it's something about the protection, but also the prevention of poor mental health. And I always like to remind people that we all have a mental health as well as a physical health. And it's really important that we look after our mental health, and it does fluctuate. And kind of a lot of the work that I do is thinking about ways to help people keep in good mental health. Okay, so I came into the Mental Health Foundation over 6 years ago now, and I came in to run a lottery project called Standing Together. And for me, I quickly learned that good housing for people in later life is much more than bricks and mortar. And so, and we know that the front door can be a real barrier for people, even when they live in a housing scheme with a shared communal space. So I guess the project Stand Together was bringing people together who might experience mental health issues. They might also just be quite lonely, and they might have come to live in a later life housing scheme in quite traumatic circumstances. So Standing Together was about running weekly peer support groups and it's all about building relationships and helping people to kind of have quite deep conversations about their identity, their passions in life, the jobs they've had previously, and kind of use things like Mental Health Awareness Week to begin to shift the conversation when we built trust up with people about how people manage to look after their mental health and what are the particular issues as you age around your mental health. As we all know, I think we are very much an aging population. This slide is about it's a group quite early on in the original Standing Together London project. And I felt it's quite an interesting one to show around nature, and it's kind of as kind of emerging from the pandemic, because I think it really struck me early on that people have very different schemes. People had very different experiences in different types of schemes, but there was one woman in this photo who hadn't been out of the house for 12 months. And she was so relieved just to get out in the garden. It wasn't straightforward at all for her to access nature. And I think, again, this is quite a good parallel to how we think about emerging from the pandemic. So after Standing Together London, we have a new project, Standing Together Cymru, which it's just coming to the end of its delivery phase now. So it's been running for nearly 2 3/4 years. And again, building on the work of the original Standing Together, but we've also had a different role. We were thinking very much more about sustainability for this piece of work. And so we had a volunteer coordinator, and we have had quite a lot of people train as volunteers. There have been challenges, as we all know, around the pandemic. And for Standing Together Cymru, they moved from a face-to-face model of delivery into sort of phoning people up and having quite small group phone calls. Again, to do a slightly scaled down version of the original project, but, you know, finding out about people's passions and interests, and very much the idea that all this work with groups, peer support groups in later life, is about the interests of the participants. It's about giving them a voice and finding out about their lives. So discussions are kind of rooted in what people want to talk about. We just finished a project as well with Anchor Hanover Housing, called Creating Connections, and that was very much about using creativity to run face-to-face groups. You can see from the pictures, we did some quite small scale creative things and some larger scale. And I don't know why I didn't say properly, but we've just had an exhibition on the windows in the office building in Finsbury Park, which featured kind of quite large scale images of the artwork by people. So the project's creating connections, and there is an online exhibition on the Mental Health Foundation website. And some of the time I try to be an artist. I'm very pro people being creative, even when they perhaps don't see themselves as an artist, because I think sometimes it's easier to say things visually than it is to say things through words. And this is a brand new project, very much coming out of the pandemic. It's around the issue of digital inclusion. And we're kind of quite aware that for a number of people in later life, who would have been very impacted by the pandemic, they weren't able to access online activities like through kind of usual means of social media. So we've got funding for a year for a new project called Picture This. And we'll be bringing people together. We're probably going to actually use a Google platform for weekly conversations, but the basis of that will be creativity and putting people in touch with different creative activities available online. I think I spoke at an all-parliamentary group about inequalities in later life mental health. And I think a big thing for me was kind of digital inclusion, but also thinking about the commissioning of mental health services in later life. I think there's a lot of emphasis on physical health and well-being and not enough on mental health and well-being. And it's a bit of a request that we start to think about a bit differently. We think, you know, as the Mental Health Foundation feels that we need to really address the issues of people in later life. Okay. So to get back to nature, I think for me during the pandemic, I found nature incredibly important. I've been doing kind of a daily drawing for quite a long time, and this was, I don't know, I think this was made probably kind of about November, December, but interestingly for me, about a quarter of an hour from where I live is this green space so I was aware of, but if you walk a little bit further round, there's a wood, and I didn't know this wood existed until the pandemic. I think really interesting to start going for walks again. My children are adults, but to walk without the usual sense of purpose, you're walking for the sheer pleasure of being in nature. So during the pandemic itself, we found that half of UK adults who experienced stress because of the pandemic said visiting green spaces such as parks helped them to cope. And I think there's a real sense about the importance of nature. And we've done some new research with YouGov just before Mental Health Awareness Week. And I kind of just put this one stat up because I think this is really important. So it's more than 1 in 10 adults find it fairly or very difficult to access nature when they wanted to. So it's just kind of think about, you know, the access to nature shouldn't be a luxury. We know with mental health that where you live, who you are, what community you are, what job you do or do not have, your social and economic status will impact your risk of poor mental health. And I think the same circumstances also reflect on people's ability to access nature as well. Okay, this is a very dense slide, but I think it reflects something about the Mental Health Foundation when we talk about a public health approach and giving people top tips. So there's a number of quite nice tips around nature. I obviously like stuff around combine nature with productivity and creativity. So that might be you take something back from nature. But I also think for me, the tip about bringing nature to you really resonates for people in later life. So it's kind of thinking it's not always possible to get outside, that people will have access issues, but there are very practical things you can do. So as simple as like looking out the window, perhaps having a bird feeder in a garden. You know, there's so much you can see, like the trees changing over a year, but also even nature programs. I mean, David Attenborough has done a lot of programs. He's 95. I saw a wonderful medley of clips of him to celebrate his 95th birthday. But there's something about that has positive benefits to even looking at programs about nature on your mental health. Makes you feel more calm, relaxed, and at peace. I'm going to pass over to Jerome because I've got Ruth's story here, and it's a case study from Mental Health Awareness Week this year, and Jerome's going to play it because it hasn't worked on my slide.
Yeah. Just give me a couple of seconds. That should be it.
Thank you.
My name is Ruth Knight. I'm at an island down.
Oops.
At an island down in in South Wales.
A little bit louder.
About my affinity with nature and how it affects my life.
I'm afraid I can't do anything about the volume.
Okay. There are subtitles.
I've always had this thing about nature. Used to help my dad.
And these are people who are part of the Standing the Cymru project.
My one brother and myself. I've always been happier out of doors than indoors. And I'm still the same today. I would rather be outside than in, unless I got something worthwhile to do. I really have such a joy when I am out here that I really don't want to be disturbed. Just leave me to it. Let me stay and do what I want to do. Everything about the garden gives me pleasure. Even the weeds, because I know they are.
Thanks, Jerome. I've got one last slide, so I think I might need to share that again, just to end with. I mean, yes, I think we should share that clip in the chat if that's possible. Not letting me do my next slide. Oh, good. Yeah. So there's a few details about where to find us at the Mental Health Foundation, and just to think about, connecting with nature and how that's so important for our mental health and well-being. Okay, thank you.
Jolie, thanks ever so much, and I'm sorry about the volume control. I don't know what happened there, but as Emily said, we will post the link up in the chat, and obviously with your slides when it goes out later, there'll be access again to that.
Thank you.
Rather than taking questions now, what I'll do is I'll move quickly on to Angelina, because I think what we can do is have a discussion and a roundtable discussion once we've finished the sort of 3 presentations, and then we may also have a few more queries coming in as well. So without further ado, can I welcome Angelina. Angela, can I also thank you and the team at Look Ahead for supporting our homelessness pages as well. I know you're going to talk a little bit about what Look Ahead does, and we're really great to have developed that partnership with you this year. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Just to say, Jolie, that was a fantastic presentation, and I completely, the message there around nature and mental health is so critically important, and we've seen that ourselves in some of our services, particularly during the pandemic, and people making use of those areas and spaces where they can get in touch with nature. So yeah, I completely endorse that message. It's fantastic. My name's Angie Morgan. I'm Director for Mental Health in Look Ahead. Look Ahead are a housing association, Look Ahead Care and Support in Housing, and we are also a care and support provider. We've been in operation for over 40 years now. We started off working with homelessness services, and then now we work across 4 main client groups, so mental health, young people, homelessness and learning difficulties. And our services are mostly spread across London and the South East. If we could move on to the next slide, please, Jerome. Thank you. Our services cross over across the whole pathway, really, mental health pathway. So we provide hospital discharge services. We work with health partners to deliver services in ward. So we'll have specialist workers that work on the hospital wards, fully integrated into access and flow teams, supporting patients in preparation for discharge back home, and in some cases working with the client to source appropriate accommodation for them and ensuring their benefits are sorted, and then supporting them with that transition back to their home or accommodation, suitable accommodation. And then we also provide hospital discharge floating support service as well, where we are working with the Health Trust and working with people in their homes or in B&B, as the case may be, after discharge from hospital, and just making sure that they reorientate back into their home environments, supporting them around medication, working with home treatment teams. We also have a number of recovery prevention services and crisis prevention services. And then we kind of go right up or right across the kind of mental health pathway, if you like, to forensic step down, where we provide high support to people being discharged from medium secure hospital and low secure hospital, through to 24/7 accommodation-based support services, complex needs, and residential care homes, through to community support. and specialist community support. So we kind of cross over the entire pathway really with regard to the services that we provide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of partnerships, like many other providers, we're increasingly working with NHS and NHS health trusts to provide services both in response to the pandemic, but also to meet the changing needs of people in local populations. In my experience, the foundations for recovery are accommodation, so housing, clinical care and support, and it's the three of those elements coming together and working together to support the individual that helps to make that recovery a seamless experience from the agencies, you know, supporting the individual. It just really does help and support the individual who's recovering. And whilst we've been delivering integrated models of care for many years now, as an organisation, last year during the pandemic, we really saw an increase in that. So as I mentioned earlier, you know, we've worked with different health trusts to set up hospital discharge services quite quickly during the pandemic. And really that was, you know, health trusts coming to look ahead and saying, you know, we've got this issue, we need some support to empty beds to free up for COVID patients, can you help us? And so it was working with health trusts to really come up with a viable solution that worked for them, for the patient being discharged, and also for us as a social care provider. So in 2019, Look Ahead commissioned Europe Economics to carry out some research into the financial case for integrated models of care. And you'll see from this slide the sort of areas that the research was based around. And although we've said that there's 5 Look Ahead core service areas, this piece of research was mainly focused around 3 core areas. And that was crisis prevention, community rehabilitation, and forensic step down. And there's just some kind of key findings that I'd like to mention here, because I think they'll be of particular interest, but also just to let you know that the report is on our website. So if you do want to take a look, I mean, I'd highly recommend having a read through the whole report, because it makes quite interesting reading. But in terms of some of the headlines, the integrated services together, so the rehabilitation, the crisis prevention and the forensic step down, when looking at all of those together in Look Ahead, there is the potential to increase capacity across NHS inpatient services. Now, there would obviously be a requirement to reallocate resources and then have collaborative working. But as I've said before, you know, earlier in my discussion, you know, we've seen it work really well where we've got integrated services. So we know that it can happen, but it does require reallocation of resources. They also found that of these 3 core service areas combined, there was the capacity to produce £5 million a year worth of cashable savings compared to hospital-based mental health care. And then the final headline that I just wanted to mention was that if we were to scale up those integrated models of care across the country, there is the potential for £1 billion worth of to achieve £1 billion worth of savings across the country. So they're quite big figures there. Though the research that was carried out by Europe Economics was based on, I think, 167 clients that were used in those 3 core service provisions at the time. So have a read of the report if you do get time, and I think we may be able to kind of put it up in the chat, the link to the website in the chat after we're finished. So in terms of, I think, yeah, just touched on that. That's just stuff that I've just covered off. So we can move on, Jerome. Thank you. So in terms of collaboration, we're working with health trusts to reconfigure their pathways currently, and this is largely through their transformation programs, and that work is underway. We do a lot of work with health trusts to model services that really do meet demand. We come up with solutions, we try to come up with solutions that support people in terms of housing, and also the support that we can provide, and also working with our clinicians and health partners for, you know, in terms of the clinical element. You know, we operate under a number of different contract terms in terms of the types of contracts that we work for. So we will subcontract a clinical element from a health trust. For example, in our rehabilitation, community rehabilitation service, we subcontract the health trust to deliver a clinical element. And then we have models where Look Ahead are, you know, the provider that is subcontracted by the health trust to come in and deliver a support element, working in a service that they commission. So there's all different sorts of, in terms of the natures of contracts, they're all different, but very much the model is kind of collaborative working. We're partners in integrated care systems, and we are looking to broaden our footprint there with regard to the development of, you know, the ICS's integrated care systems. We're looking to broaden our footprint, and obviously Look Ahead are in a fortunate position because we are a housing association, and you know, we do have a property portfolio, which I think is, as I've mentioned before, you know, really critical in terms of discussions around mental health moving forward, mental health and people living in the community. You know, we've got to make sure that housing associations, housing providers, housing departments are part of that discussion as we move forward, particularly with the reforms under the coming under the Mental Health Act, and people being assessed and discharged from hospital. You know, we need the accommodation to offer to people being discharged into the community. So housing is really critical in terms of moving forward. And I think it's also important that, you know, we are using social housing to free up bed capacity over the next couple of years. So I think that's pretty much it from me. Thank you very much.
Angie, thanks ever so much. Sorry, I was just taking a little bit of time to unmute myself and also to get back onto screen. Really interesting presentation. And I know the issues around integration, obviously with the Queen's speech this week, which touched on the needs for the Health and Social Care Bill to look at the further development of integrated care systems. One of the real critical things is, well, how can housing be part of that partnership? It's something I know that Look Ahead are very much engaged with at a local, within local health and social care economies, and I think what you've highlighted in terms of the benefits of having a housing partner on those sort of care efficiencies and cost implications is really really important, and I look forward to sort of having a bit of a wider discussion with you later on in this happy hour session. But thanks ever so, that was really really useful, and I can see that Jerome has posted the link to the report in the chat box for anybody who's interested. Our final speaker is Ben Channon, and Ben, really pleased that you could join us this afternoon. You're very much someone who I've always looked at in terms of the publications in particular, and I know that you work very closely thinking around where space, place and our environment, how critical that is for our well-being. So I'm going to pass over to you to learn more. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Well, thank you very much, firstly, for having me, and thanks as well to Jolie and Angelina for their presentations, which were really interesting, and I think will link up quite nicely with quite a few of the things that I wanted to say. So I'm going to try and share my screen. Has that worked for everybody? I've got a thumbs up. Fantastic. Great. Yeah. So today I'm going to touch quickly upon how I think about designing for happiness, and really how the designs, the buildings that we're designing, or even wider than the buildings, that the city itself can support our mental well-being and actually better support our mental health. Is it going to change page for me? There we go. So I won't talk about myself for too long because nobody wants to hear that. But that's kind of my background information here anyway. So I trained as an architect, but effectively went through my own problems with my mental health in my mid-20s, just burned myself out really, and gave myself a lot of kind of problems to do with anxiety, and had some CBT for that, and thankfully kind of came out the other side of it. But I think it's important to talk about that, firstly, because obviously it's Mental Health Awareness Week, and I think we all need to be open about the challenges we've faced. And the more open, the more dialogue we can have about those things, then the easier it is for anybody else who is dealing with it. So if it's something you are going through or have been going through, then completely empathize, and all I can say is stay positive and keep thinking positive thoughts about the future, because things can and do get better. But also it's important to say, because it's informed where I've ended up going in my career. So off the back of those issues, I became really interested in that relationship between architecture and mental health and started researching it. I'd not really been taught too much about it at university. So went away and started looking that sort of stuff up, and it basically led me to write my first book, Happy by Design. And actually, excitingly, I've just finished writing my second book, or well, I say finished writing. I've sent off the first draft of the manuscript to the publisher, so hopefully it won't be too much more writing when they come back with comments. But that's due to come out towards the end of the year, I think, and that's kind of building exactly upon this subject. So a lot of the research from that book is actually kind of feeding into this presentation too. But yeah, that then led me to go and join Eckist, who are a design for wellbeing consultancy, and we basically help architects and design teams to create healthier buildings and healthier places. So the first thing I wanted to ask really is, why should we be thinking about this? Probably quite a lot of people out there might be thinking, well, architecture doesn't really have that much to do with our mental health. And without going into the stats too much, because we've already had a lot of really interesting information from Jolie and Angelina on this already. But as you'll all probably be aware, mental health can be, or ill mental health can be a big problem, particularly in the UK at the moment. It's something that we've seen some pretty shocking stats on in the last few years, both in terms of the impact on people, and it's worth saying the impact on the economy as well. And the reason architecture comes into this is that actually we spend a massive amount of our time inside buildings, and even if we're not in buildings, most of the population lives in urban areas, and this figure is just set to rise and rise, really, they predict. So when we're not in a building, we're near buildings, and they are having an impact on the setting of where we are generally. This is important because we now have scientific evidence and data to prove that the environment, the spaces around us, the materials, the colors, the proportions of a space, they can all have an impact on how we feel and even how we behave. And kind of fundamentally, that means there's a scientific case for us to do this. There's definitely an ethical case that we should be designing buildings to take better care of people. And also that the way that we can get developers and people on board as well is that there's actually a really strong business case that when you design buildings that are better for people's mental health, they function better, they interact with each other better, they're more productive. And so from whether it's office building to homes, the spaces become more valuable too. And you might be wondering how much difference a building can really make. And I think it's really important to say that a building is not going to cure a serious mental health problem. Someone who's suffering with schizophrenia or PTSD, something very major, serious mental health condition, we're obviously not going to be able to cure that just by giving someone a slightly nicer home. However, it's worth saying that we all sit somewhere on this bell curve with mental health. You've got a few people up here who have got incredible mental health, few people down the bottom who are obviously the worst of the worst. But most of us sit kind of in this middle band. Like most things, the spread of the population is over a bell curve. And on any given day, our mental health is kind of like our physical health. Any given day, you can wake up feeling physically maybe a bit run down or physically a bit more energized. And same with our mental health. We can feel better or worse given a number of circumstances and issues on any given day. And what we know is that good design can just make people's lives that little bit better. They can improve how you feel on a daily basis. And effectively, what we can do is take everybody and shift them a few points up this bell curve. So actually, rather than the majority of us being on 50%, maybe we're up even 52, 53%. If you think about the impact that can have across an enormous population, then that's actually, there's huge impacts there. And a lot of these issues which factor into mental ill health are actually things that we can change and affect through the built environment. So just very quickly, do we really think that the way we're living our lives today best support our mental health? I love this image from the Wellcome collection. It's a 19th century German artist's idea of what early Homo sapien life was like. And whether you take this as gospel or not, a few things are certain about that, the early Homo sapien lifestyle. Firstly, we were very, very active. As you can see, fighting a bear, there is certainly burning a lot of calories there. But importantly, we were living as a part of nature. And Jolie talked about the importance of nature, obviously the theme this week, this year for Mental Health Awareness Week. And all the research shows us, as we'll come on to see, that nature can play a massive role in our mental health. We followed the rhythms of nature too. We went to bed when it got dark and got up when it got light. We were very, very social. We lived in big communities. If anyone's read the book Sapiens, the author touches upon that. We lived in much larger communities than often we do now. We were engaged with our senses, and we relied on our senses to survive. And we were constantly kind of aware of our surroundings. We were wired for danger. Compare this to this chap living a kind of typical modern life. We're fairly sedentary. A lot of people, large percentage of people, aren't getting the recommended amount of exercise that the World Health Organization tells us we should be getting every week. We're pretty isolated from nature, to the point where people kind of think that nature is something over in the distance that we go and visit, forgetting that we are natural creatures. And as a result, we don't follow those natural rhythms. We use electric lighting to keep our homes bright way into the evening. So we go to sleep when we want, rather than following those natural rhythms. And actually, we are often a lot more solitary or lonely. Again, things that have been touched upon in both the talks so far, this idea of kind of loneliness and isolation. We don't use as many of our senses as we used to. Certainly, we don't rely on them in the same way. We're much more visual. A lot of what we do, obviously, is screen-based, as this call demonstrates. But interestingly, we still got a lot of those old sort of reptilian parts of the brain, the ancient parts of the brain, which dominate things like our fight or flight mechanism. And so we still are kind of constantly wired for danger, and resulting in, lots of, you might still get shaky palms or sweaty palms, or a bit shaky before a big meeting, because you think your body's telling you there's a threat, when in actual fact, it's not really, there's no real threat to you. So my big question really has been trying to understand how can the way that we design buildings address some of these issues, and hopefully try to tap into, or sort of activate and support the bodies that we've evolved to have in a slightly better way. So normally this presentation would normally take about 40 minutes. So I'm up against it a little bit. So I will touch very quickly on each of these topics, but these are loosely connected to the chapters of Happy by Design and the next book. And they're really just exploring some ways in which our environment can impact how we feel and our overall mental health and mental well-being. Obviously, sleep, a massive factor in our mental health, and both natural and artificial light can play a really important role in this. So we need to get lots of light early in the mornings, lots of natural light, to wake our brain up, get our circadian rhythms going. And that affects loads of stuff, our hormones, when we get hungry, even when we need to go to the loo, and of course, when we sleep. So if we don't get enough natural light into buildings, this can really affect our sleep and obviously have a big knock-on effect on our mental health. But it's also important to remember that artificial light, particularly bright and kind of bluer light on the spectrum, can actually trick our brain into thinking that it's morning, even if it's 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night, and really disrupt that circadian rhythm. So when we're specifying lighting in buildings, it's really important we think about things like that too. And there's also a comfort factor here as well. If we've got things like lights that are flickering, or giving glare, these can result in things like headaches too. So there's a big impact on comfort if we don't get that design right. Coming on to comfort, also and materials, the way that we actually fit out buildings, this can have a huge impact on how we feel on a day-to-day basis. Not just is my chair comfortable, which obviously is important, particularly these days if we're spending maybe 7 or 8 hours a day sat in an office chair, or heaven forbid, just a standard kitchen chair like I am now. But that can play a big role in our physical health and musculoskeletal health, which then obviously the two systems are very linked. And if we're physically in pain, our mental health suffers. But also there's a lot of interesting research into how material choice affects how we feel. So for example, natural materials like timber can have very positive effects, lowering heart rate, reducing stress, activating what's called our parasympathetic nervous system. So yeah, again, selecting materials like that can have a big impact. And also using them in such a way, like in this scheme here, where they become acoustic baffles. So actually we're achieving other things like acoustic comfort using those materials, or maybe thermal comfort, all of which can have an impact on how we feel. Giving people control and autonomy over how they live their lives is a really key part of mental well-being. And perhaps a better way of saying that is, as soon as you start taking control away from people, it becomes incredibly frustrating and has a really negative impact on how we feel. So we want to design buildings that give people choice, that are adaptable, and that people can use in lots of different ways. Although it's worth saying, sometimes too much choice can actually be a bad thing as well. There's research out there showing that when you give people too much choice, it can actually be seen as quite paralyzing for some people. It actually stop people from moving forward and making a decision. So we need to get that balance right, but ultimately it's about creating flexible places, giving people things like privacy, and a choice of, do I want to spend time in a busy space or a quiet space? Bringing natural elements into buildings is one of the most important things we can do, and it's also one of the most researched areas out there. As I mentioned, we obviously evolved over millions of years living within nature. And now many of us have less contact than any generation has in the past with nature. And some of the statistics coming out of things like the RSPB about children's connectedness to nature are really worrying. So it's really important that we do start to bring natural elements back into projects, back into buildings. But yeah, this idea of biophilia, the word means in Greek basically love of life. And the theory is that effectively we have an inherent need or desire to be connected to nature. And there's so much incredible data out there about what happens when you bring nature or natural materials or even views of nature, or even, as Jolie was saying earlier, I think watching wildlife documentaries, the impact that can have on helping people feel calmer, increasing productivity, even like reducing crime rates, increasing sales values in retail units. The impacts are mind-blowing. So there really is clearly some very strong link within our minds, within the very deepest parts of our mind, about the importance of nature in buildings. Aesthetics is a difficult one because it is so subjective. We do hear quite a lot of things like color theory bandied about, saying that maybe blue will make you depressed or pink will make you relaxed. But actually, it's quite hard to find solid research that proves those points. However, there is evidence and research on some areas of aesthetics. So I've already mentioned higher ceilings, for example, and the proportions of spaces. We know that actually research tends to show that a ceiling height of around 3 meters tends to make people feel more relaxed in the home. And there's interesting studies been done in prisons where actually when there's lower ceiling heights, you tend to get male prisoners in particular become more aggressive, and you get higher rates of incidents. So actually stuff like the aesthetic proportions of a space can have a big impact on how we feel in them. And also it's worth talking about legibility, making sure that places are easy for people to use, easy to navigate. They're not intimidating, they're not overwhelming. And of course, that idea, again, coming back to safety, it's been obviously a massive issue in the news this year with everything that's been going on about creating safe streets for people. But again, creating legible places is a really important part of that. Again, we can bring ideas of biophilia in at this point and talk about organic shapes, natural patterns, which are all shown again to have a positive impact on how we feel. And Lily Bernheimer touches on this in her great book, The Shaping of Us, which I would recommend you read if you're interested in this subject. And finally, thinking and remembering about joy. It's something that if we're not careful, we can get a bit bogged down in the science, which of course we need to have evidence base for everything. But that idea of creating a moment of joy, whether it's through an amazing view or a piece of art or a bold splash of color somewhere, something that just jolts you out of your day-to-day kind of dreary average lives that we all tend to lead, and not every single day is, we're not visiting natural wonders of the world every day. So it's nice to have those moments of joy in our daily lives. In terms of activity and exercise, now this is a really powerful way to improve how people feel. We obviously know that by getting people more active, there's huge benefits for their physical health, life expectancy, all this kind of stuff. However, when we take even a short amount of moderate exercise, 20 minutes or so, we can get mood benefits that last 7 or 8 hours because we get endorphins, we get serotonin, all these feel-good chemicals released into our bodies. And as it says there, we can also boost some of these important things that we've already spoken about today, our ideas of social connection and sense of community. Now, you might be thinking, how can design of buildings impact that? How can it make people more active? Well, it can be anything from obviously providing like direct activity spaces like gyms or maybe a swimming pool, or even just a small space with a couple of dumbbells or whatever, a rowing machine, something quite small and simple like that. But it can also be about actually trying to get people to just be more active in their daily life. So this great image here, active staircases. This was a project where they wanted to try and promote people to use the stairs instead of take the lift. So the stairs became a visual, like talking of moments of joy, a visually pleasant place, lots of nature. It's a stopping place, it's a social space. And of course, thinking about how we get people to work or how we get people home. Is there safe bike storage? Can they have a shower and use a changing room and use a locker when they get to work? All of these small things that can actually have a really big impact on people's mental health. And of course, the same rules apply when we're thinking about housing. And then finally, how can we foster those important ideas of social interaction and community that all the speakers today have touched upon? Obviously, it's a hugely important aspect for our physical and our mental health. And I think only in recent years, really, have we discovered just how bad loneliness is for our physical health, strangely. As the stats say there, it increases morbidity rates by over a quarter, and which is the equivalent to being obese or smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So it really is important that when we're designing homes, we need to start thinking about how we can use social spaces or even streets, whatever it might be, to get people to interact more and to try and address those issues of loneliness. There's been some really interesting housing typologies come forward in the last couple of years as well, where we're looking at kind of whether it's co-housing, co-living, build to rent, but also one-off houses. Is a great example called the 3-generation house in the Netherlands. And it's basically, it was designed for a family who, two parents with their kids wanted to live in the bottom 2 floors. And then they moved their parents, so the grandparents, into the top 2 floors. And it's a 5-story building. The middle story is kind of it's like the middle of the Venn diagram. It's where they can meet and interact. And so it's like they have their own separate homes, but actually they've got that dedicated space in the center for social interaction. So I'm really fascinated by how buildings can provide opportunities and ways in which we can be more social and address those issues like loneliness. So as a very quick summary, this is something we've got to think about from the outset of design, really. It's not an add-on, a bit like chucking a solar panel or a wind turbine on the roof of a building won't suddenly make it sustainable. We can't just put out, chuck a few pot plants or a bowl of fruit in at the end and say we've got a healthy building. We've got to think about this stuff right from the beginning of designing housing. Really key point is that we are now seeing lots of financial benefits from this too. So if a client tells you that, I can't afford to do this, actually there's lots of data demonstrating that when you design buildings with well-being at the heart of them, they actually command higher price premiums, whether that's rental or for sale. So it's really important that there is a strong business case and return on investment for this too. There are lots of different ways that we can do this. I've touched upon some of them today, but obviously trying to squeeze it into a short space. So haven't been able to share all of the different techniques and ideas that we look at. But really it depends on a different project, whether it's even 2 different housing projects have very different needs. But obviously then when we start looking at education or commercial spaces, whatever it might be, hospital spaces, very, very different needs for all of them. We need to approach them in different ways. But fundamentally, if we start with the human, if we start with the person and think about how they're going to use a space, how they're going to react to a space, and what's going to make them feel better on a day-to-day basis, and use the evidence that's coming out of environmental psychology and neuroscience, rather than what our own personal taste is, or maybe anecdotal experience or stories we've heard, then fundamentally we will be creating better buildings for everybody, which will support better mental health for those who use them. Thank you very much.
Ben, thank you for compressing such a fantastic presentation into that time. But as you may have seen in the chat box, a lot of people saying fantastic information, might want to have a little bit of access to some of the data sources as well. But I do encourage people to look at your first book, and perhaps we can come back to you when the second book is to do a promo of that at a later stage. But I think all 3 presentations have flowed really beautifully. and I've certainly learnt a lot around mental health services. I've got some questions for you, but first of all, I just want to have a quick look into the Q&A box, because I know we've got a couple in there. In fact, the first one is from Donna: where can we access the scientific data? So either do please respond in the live chat. And also Tony raises a really interesting point about sort of this integration to more mainstream. So again, is there any comments from any three of you on that? And Donna again is talking about people's experiences around living roofs and roof gardens, and that's really interesting as well, looking at different green space. And I think one of your early slides, Ben, had the Italian reference to it, and of course there's the Milan scheme, which is based on the green space as well. You may have some comments on that. So any Jolie, Angie and Ben, any responses to any of those particular questions to start off with?
Oh, I think you're muted, Jolie.
Yeah, okay, no longer muted. I think there's a lot of evidence kind of around Mental Health Awareness Week in Nature on our website, so do have a look there. And kind of we did a YouGov poll just about the 6th and the 8th of April, really thinking about how people were engaging with nature, what was working for them, less so. So I would begin there with the first question.
Fantastic. Angie, I was just wondering, one of the things, and you mentioned the sort of relationship with health and integrated care system, and I think what Ben's presentation highlights is the personal bit about how we can self-manage and support ourselves better if we have the right environment. I'm just wondering whether you've got examples from the services that Look Ahead offer around social prescribing, and whether that's all self-care, self-management linked back to social prescribing, or whether through health or adult social care, whether there are any examples that may come to spring to your mind.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Ben's got some examples himself, but certainly from our perspective, one example that sprung to mind when Ben was talking was our forensic mental health service. And when we that service was commissioned around about 4 or 5 years ago now, the building was really important to, it was a crucial aspect of that service. And making sure that the building was reconfigured to the right design for the people that would be living there. The majority of the people that were moving into that service were people stepping down from medium secure hospital who had generally had quite long-term stays in hospital. And so we worked really closely with the Health Trust to ensure that the way that the building was configured and remodelled would be conducive to the recovery of the people living in there. So we looked at spaces, you know, we were knocking down walls, we were putting walls up, we were kind of creating various colour schemes in there. So I guess in terms of co-production and making sure that the people that were going to be living in there had a voice in that, we made sure to kind of bring them in and consult with them on the design of the building. And even with regard to the landscaping of the garden, we really invested in making sure that it was going to help the people and be a relaxing space for the people living in there. So, you know, we spent quite a bit of money in terms of making sure that the garden was landscaped correctly. But all the people that were going to be living in there had a view on the first cohort of customers living in there had a view on colour schemes, what they wanted the garden to look like and feel like. And even to today, that garden space is used really well. People will go out there and just sit down, take a moment, recalibrate, socialise. So I think the building structure is really important in terms of ensuring that the people living in there, first of all, feel that it's their home. That's really important, and that there's a clear distinction between the accommodation and the environment where they're coming from, which is the ward, so that it's not institutionalized but replicates an environment that they can turn their front door key and really feel like they're at home. And that's really important to us, as well as it being a safe environment.
I think that's
really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. The community involvement thing is so vital. It's really important that we engage with people who are going to ultimately use the buildings that we're designing for them. I think far too often, and I've certainly been guilty of it in the past, architecture projects that I've worked on, but sort of designing a building with very little actually kind of consultation with the end users. And unfortunately, it still happens a lot. And it's something that I think the architecture profession needs to get better at doing. There are some practices out there that do it amazingly. And when you see it done well, the results could be incredible. But, you know, a car manufacturer or someone, even movie producers, you know, the amount of consultation they do with their audiences before they sort of put out a final product is enormous, and yet doesn't seem to happen as much in the built environment, which is really interesting to me. There's a really good group of landscape architects called the Edible Bus Stop, and they got their name from the first project they ever did, where they turned a bus stop into a kind of garden. And they do lots of amazing community work. And what you're just saying there, Angelina, really reminded me of some of their work, sort of working in close collaboration with communities, where they actually get the communities to help them design the garden, to build the garden. And actually, you know, you're getting benefits there, not just from that nature and biophilia, but also from that building of and strengthening of a community. And it comes back to, as you were saying, that sense of ownership, sense of identity. These are all things that I've literally just been reading a lot about for the next book. But we know that, you know, your sense of identity, your sense of pride in your where you live, and sort of as a byproduct, your sense of pride in yourself is so important to your mental health. Feeling like you have a sense of value, and that is directly linked. If you live in a low quality house, you feel like, you know, the landlord doesn't care about you. The knock-on impacts that can have on someone's sense of self-identity could be huge. So really important things to think about.
That's very helpful again. And in fact, it reminds me, Ben, of, I don't know if you've come across Dean Hawkes, who's the Emeritus Professor of Architecture at Cambridge University. No, and I think Jerome's put up his case study for the Lynn on the circadian house he developed. But he always talked about the longing and belonging. So, you know, how the feeling, I think, that you captured, that emotive bit, is about that identity in relation to both the home that you live in, but the place that you live in as part of that neighbourhood as well. Julie raises a really interesting question about PI, psychologically informed environments. Now, obviously, there's something that the housing sector has done some work, and she works at Riverside. Any thoughts on the use of PI in that approach from any of you?
Well, I mean, certainly from our perspective, we use the psychologically informed environment approach when we're reconfiguring or remodeling any of our buildings. Even when we sort of start a new service and it's an existing building and we're not remodeling the building, we will be thinking about psychologically informed environments. So for us, it really is about looking at, firstly, you know, what are the needs of the people that are going to be living here, and what is going to be conducive to supporting them in their recovery. And so we'll look at things like, you know, those soft furnishings, that side, right through to kind of security and safety. So all of that stuff we'll take into consideration, and also, you know, creating spaces where people, yes, they have their own individual flats, but that there are some where we have community spaces as well, so that people can come together, because obviously that's also really important for all of us. You know, we all yearn, we're human beings, we yearn social contact by our very nature. So it's really important for us to be creating spaces as much as we can for people to also come together in a safe and warm and welcoming environment, and just to kind of sit down and spend time. So yeah, we do use psychologically informed environments when we're thinking about how we model our buildings.
Well, I mean, I'll throw this open to everybody who's watching and listening. I mean, we're very interested in sort of picking up on that. So if anybody wants to write a blog for us on their approach and experiences on PI, it would be great to publish. You may also know that Jolie has actually published a blog for us today, very much still building on her Standing Together presentation. We also published 2 other blogs this week, one from Central and Cecil, based on the research they've undertaken with their older residents about how to support people during lockdown, combating loneliness and isolation. And on a very similar vein, we heard from Clarion Housing Group how they've used Talk Together about a program called Me in Mind, where people can ring in and use digital platforms to anonymously get support. So I was going to ask everybody here on the call, we haven't heard a lot about technology and digital from any of you. You may have hinted at it, but I was just thinking whether there's any more things that you might think about, either from the architectural element about how we should be thinking about it, as well as the application to support people address issues. So any thoughts from that?
I would just quite like to pick up on this new project, Picture This. And one of the huge issues is about the lack of Wi-Fi in kind of later life housing, and how we really address that in an economic way. And I think, you know, given our aging population, we're going to be living very differently in a few years in terms of people's digital literacy going forward. So I think, you know, making buildings where it's possible for the Wi-Fi to be everywhere in every flat is really important in going forward. But in terms of this project, which we're working with Anchor, Hanover and Notting Hill Genesis on, we are actually recruiting tomorrow, like facilitators who are going to be who will be housing their housing association staff, and their role will be very much to be that means of support for people who might struggle digitally. And it's not like, we really feel it's really important that the support is ongoing. So it's not like we don't have an expectation that people necessarily remember and retain how to get onto different programs. We hope people will over time, but we want to take that pressure away from people. So the idea is that with ongoing support, people will improve their literacy of digital activities.
That's really good. And in fact, it links back very neatly to what you were saying right at the outset about understanding inequalities. So again, you know, digital exclusion that's been out there. Ben, any thoughts around this in terms of the more the physical side of our architecture?
Yeah, for me, I think technology, you know, I think it's quite easy to, I've seen a lot of stories over the last year in the news, kind of either, you tend to get very polar opposite views, people kind of writing articles saying either technology is evil and it's causing everyone to be really lonely and isolated, or, you know, you get other views, people saying that technology is the answer to all of our problems. And in truth, obviously, it's neither of those things, but it does present a lot of really exciting opportunities. One of the really exciting ones to me is about tackling some of those issues to do with like health inequalities. Firstly, we can use it in so many different ways to make an environment healthier, you know, whether that's like monitoring air quality, water quality, all these kind of things. And within a few years, I expect a lot of those technologies will become very, very commonplace in homes, in offices. And, you know, hopefully we can create better buildings, healthier buildings, just using some really simple bits of technology, which are already available, and the cost is coming down year on year. But, you know, in terms of some of those technologies that we're seeing now, like even things like Ring doorbell, giving someone the ability to answer their door, if you're a wheelchair user, say, and it's really tough for you to get up and answer your door, your delivery driver might have been and gone by the time you've even managed to get in your wheelchair, say. So actually, we can use technology to really empower people. We can give them so much. I talked about control and autonomy. We can give people so much more control over their homes, over their workplaces. You know, being able to have so many different light configurations, different temperatures, brightnesses, all at the push of a button, change the temperature of your home, humidity, all of these different things. Admittedly, like, it may seem like a long way off from where we're at now, but we all know how quickly technology comes on and develops. And I do think within quite a short period of time, I hope anyway, that we are going to have a lot of technology that improves the lives of many, many people.
Thanks. I think, you know, the important thing is is both for the social connectedness, which is really important, as well as the social contact that's needed, let alone sort of a response service to whether the way the building functions or accessing care and support. There are a couple of other questions I want to sort of go to before we sort of draw this to a close. There's an interesting question from Emma, who talks about managing sheltered housing scheme and what the panel's view is on having communal meals to supporting people both in relation to their mental and physical health. Any thoughts from Jolie, Angie, or Ben?
I agree with Emma's point that it's hugely beneficial. Absolutely, it's something that's highlighted in the Well Building Standards. You know, trying to provide spaces for, I think it's 25% of a building's occupants to all eat together. And we know that there's huge benefits associated with that. Obviously, kind of community benefits, but also benefits in terms of nourishment, nutrition. We know that when people, interesting bit of research came up a couple of years ago looking at older people and diet. And when people are alone and don't see other people, they actually tend to eat less healthy foods too. So yes, big benefits from communal eating. Sorry, I'm aware I'm hogging the microphone, so I'll shut up now.
No, I think it's a really important point.
I think you make a really valid point then. Yeah, really valid point, and we see that in our care homes as well. We provide communal spaces, kitchens and dining rooms for our clients to come together and eat, and it's really, really important to avoid isolation. I mean, people can eat in their own rooms, but the space is there and it's available for people to eat together, and they do. And it's the same as people coming together in the garden area. One of our care homes in Hackney, they created some beautiful artwork during the lockdown in the garden area together. But yeah, no, definitely in terms of the communal eating environments, I think it's really important for people to have an opportunity to sit down together and eat together, because it's very sociable as well. So yeah.
Yeah, just something about nutrition is so fundamental, and how eating every meal on your own it's difficult, and we know about a lot of malnourishment, and I think that's part of it. I'm also kind of thinking about the pandemic a little bit and how that was really difficult, but I know of schemes where people were having cups of tea outside each other's flats just to keep a sense of social connection. But also there's something so important about eating and drinking. Cake and refreshment, sometimes healthy, was such an important part of the standing together work. So there's something about the sharing of food and the breaking of bread that feels fundamental to human existence, really.
Jolie, that's really interesting, because I think one of the things we've experienced, and we asked many of the Housing Link members to send examples of how they were working closely with residents across both sheltered extra care and supported living schemes. And you've already touched on things around creativity, whether that's through art. We also know that singing and drawing were really important, as well as food, as well as playing games. So we've compiled an A to Z of different methods that were approached. So again, we'll put that in the chat box if people are interested, because I think these things are the real challenge for us now, is how we sustain these coming through as things open up as of Monday. So again, some real issues about how we maintain this, not just as a crisis response, but we build in that resilience that we showed, and how we sustain that going forward.
And how we do support people on their own terms as they emerge, I think is really, really important, to how people build up their confidence again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've got one other question, if I may just hog this for a minute, is that when I was listening to the presentations, what came across to me was this sort of the need to try and avoid a sort of a specialism versus mainstream housing. But often when we talk about supporting people around mental wellness and mental health issues, we are often in our sort of specialist housing world thinking about supported housing or extra care housing. And while it's really important that we enable access to psychological therapies, a number of ways of communication, I'm just wondering whether we should be thinking better how we design both our buildings for delivering supported housing, as well as the type of wraparound services, so that we can help more signposting and accessing to services. Now, I'm just wondering whether that struck a chord with any of you.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, no, please do. I thought I'd frozen for a minute.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. It's something which I guess from Look Ahead's perspective, what we do try to do is, and I think I mentioned it earlier as well, when we know that there is a demand and a need, we'll try and come up with a property solution if we can, and it really is about working, if we need to remodel that building to make sure that it is conducive to the individuals that are going to be living there, their recovery, then we will do that. It will be very much needs-led. Yes, we have the property, we also have the kind of expertise around the care and support, but for us, it's about not just offering a solution as in, here's a building, now please fill it up with people. It really is about making sure that we invest in that property, so that the people moving in and coming through the property, it aids their recovery, rather than it's just this kind of hollow building. There's a key to your door, now there you go. So we do try to kind of, I guess we try to make sure that we work as best we can with our partners, health partners and local authority partners, commissioning partners, to make sure that we're offering them a solution that works for the people that are going to be living there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's good. And I think what you've talked about is like recovery and reablement, which then also conversely links in what Jolie was saying earlier about prevention as well. So Jolie, were you going to come in?
Yeah, so yes, it was to echo that, and from a slightly outsider perspective, I think the kind of needs based, but also then bringing that element of co-production. And for me, it's about how flexible new builds can be, and also how, you know, late of life to end of life care will change. People will be buying a lot of extra care. How can a flat have that flexibility to adapt to somebody's needs, but also involve them in those changes and give it a certain amount, give that individuality, but also kind of really make the environment a delightful space to live in, rather than something that becomes towards the end of life quite institutional feeling.
It's something that we looked at quite a bit when I was at my previous company, Assail Architecture, where I used to work as an architect, residential architect, and we look quite a lot at later living and how do you design so that homes are adaptable enough to allow for care to come in as and when needed, basically. And I think that one of the big issues we're facing in housing at the moment is that, yes, minimum space standards are excellent because they do mean that obviously when they're adhered to, we do get homes that are no smaller than certain sizes. However, the danger of them is it can become a little bit like they almost become a target. It's like, we need to deliver all our 1-bedroom flats to be exactly 50 meters squared, no bigger, because we're allowed to go as low as 50 meters squared. But actually we found when you go up to even just 55 meters squared, all of a sudden the extra space that gives you in a layout in terms of, adaptability, flexibility, bringing care in down the line, it makes a home so much better in terms of longevity and adaptability. So it's definitely something I'd recommend people look into.
Yeah, no, definitely, Ben. And I think Jerome has posted in the chat box the fact sheet that we've produced on extra care housing, which also includes minimum standards. And I think it's either 54 or 55 meters square. And you're absolutely right, that the ability then to have a bit more space, to be care ready as well, that really helps. Look, I'm afraid I'm going to pull it together because we're just about a minute or so away from our end time. I hope we've managed to answer most of the questions. I'm conscious that, Gus, you've raised some really interesting points personally, and I very much hope that in conversations that you have locally around the role of scheme managers and the like can help, and some of the information you've got from today will help sort of arm you with any future conversations. I also want to say, Jolie, you mentioned issues around end-of-life care. What you may not know, this week is not just Mental Health Awareness Week, it's also Dying Matters Week. So again, there's been a number of other activities going on throughout the week on supporting people around bereavement and end-of-life care within a housing setting. And we look forward in the Lynn putting the spotlight on that in a few weeks' time in June, when we invite a housing association in London who are working very closely with several hospices. But I also just want to give a big thanks to all three of you for 3 scintillating presentations. As I said earlier, I've learned a lot, and I hope it's opened the eyes to everybody who's been watching or will be listening on the repeat show, not on Dave, but on Housing Lynn events archive page. And a big thanks from all of us. And if you found this of interest, next week, just to give a quick plug to our happy hour next week, it is Dementia Awareness Week next week, and we're having a particular spotlight on thinking about how we may retrofit and adapt our existing homes. So again, some of this will pick up, I'm sure, from a number of the points that Ben, Angie and Jolie have touched on today. On behalf of the Housing Lynn, thanks ever so, and we look forward to seeing you again, if not next week, at a future Housing Lynn event. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.